So I think there is this almost like fetishization of data collection. Yeah. It's like it will come from the heavens and tell us what to do, and we won't have to make the hard decision. Yeah. And that will never go away. I think we've been collecting data forever. We collect it on paper. Now it's like ubiquitous, and there's surveillance. I don't think that we are lacking data to tell us what we should be focusing on and funding.
Let's start off with, what is responsible innovation, and why is this important for a growing economy like Toronto? It's a big word for people who may not know what that term means and why it's important.
Yeah, I mean, responsible, and it's so brilliant to see all of you here. Yeah. And again, gorgeous day, and that this is so important to everyone and has been important for a long time now. That's a sign of what responsible really means today, where, yes, there are things like corporate responsibility. Historically, those have been very narrow, but now we have more and more demand for a level of responsibility, both in terms of federal, municipal, and civic responsibility, the kind of work that you guys are already doing by showing up and having these conversations. So in the biggest sense, to have the kind of data relationships, sense of public space and how public transit works, how to sort out some of the problems around housing. I don't know. Somehow I think technology is part of all this. I mean, I do. Responsibility also is calling upon us again in a really strong way, because we're now at a moment of shift where we're not just passive consumers. We are the city that we want to become.
Mm-hmm. I think I would just add that I have been thinking a lot about responsibility, and often we talk about like who is responsible, and this I think all of us are, and that like at this table we need to be present. So thank you for being here, everybody. And I think that I've been personally thinking a lot about how we think about end users when we think about responsibility, so like reducing harm of a product or a service. But I have been learning about how workers are a part of that conversation as well, right? So when we are producing something that's a product or a service or a platform, we also have to look at who is being asked to do the work and what are the conditions in which they're doing work. So the responsibility extends not just to the end user, but also the people who are enabling that to happen. So all of those things, to me, play a part when we think about innovation, which is literally just finding new and hopefully better ways of doing things. What is the harm quotient in that? And being very, very aware of what the trade-offs are and who's making them.
Mm-hmm. I think you two said, something that will lead organically into the next question. You talked about being passive, people being passive when it comes to their data, and also about thinking about the workers who create the products that we use. I'm wondering, have you seen any difference with how people are engaging with technology? In the last year or so, I feel like there's been a shift. We're seeing private citizens, but as well as workers stepping up and saying, okay, I don't know if this is okay. I might not agree with what my company is doing. Have you seen a change at all?
I think that when we look at Toronto and we look at the arrival of Sidewalk Labs and the positioning of that project, what we've seen is a small vocal minority who essentially said, cease and desist. We don't understand why this private company is arriving from crossing borders and offering certain types of services. And I think at the very least, we are indebted to that kind of activist effort, because they literally have started conversation. And now we're in this moment, we're having this conversation. So one of the questions I would ask us, and this isn't abstract, this is everyday stuff that's already baked into when we walk down the street, the things that happened. Instead of trying to simply kind of hunker down and make this about data privacy, and we're happy to talk about things that aren't data, but right now, I mean, that's my obsession. What if we say, what are we willing to risk for civic good? So for example, right now we have on King Street, the King Street pilot, where you can't drive a car down. If you bike down, you're allowed to, but you might get smashed because the bike lanes aren't really working. But you can only, so they're trying to get the streetcar to go faster. That was the basic bottom line request. Can we create efficiency over this going faster? So instead of doing an infrastructure thing where you change the shape of the street, they did a data thing where they start to collect data and move the cars off. That was the other actual thing. So all of that sounds good, and it's the city of Toronto, and these are good-minded, fair people who are putting the project together. Mm-hmm. With that said, and pretty much leaving it at that, everyone here would vote for faster moving streetcar, less traffic, right. But this technology sniffs the address of your cell phone. This technology sniffs the address of your inboard dash on the vehicle that you're riding through on, not your bike. But
so what is
if you
sniffs?
have a car,
like for people who don't know what that means?
It means that without asking your permission as the human part of you and your machine, the individual identifier, the MAC address of your phone, is taken up. And it's taken up, in this case, as a counting device. You've got one, well, maybe you don't have a cell phone. You've got one. So everyone in the room who's got a cell phone, it's counted so they can accurately count. This is a Bluetooth, it's none of it's new technology. This is barely smart even. And the purpose is to know how many people and how many vehicles go by. In addition to that, there's a camera. I forget what, like fisheye camera. So it's like a 360 camera. So there are cameras on the busiest streets in Toronto all the time. And again, these cameras are to do the good work of cutting down traffic. But is there a sign that says if you're crossing the street, there's a camera? Do you have any idea what happens when the image of people or cars is taken and put into kind of the data stream? So I'm not saying this to be paranoid, because I kind of roped you all into agreeing that this was a good experiment. And it's not run by a private company, it's run by the city, and it's for our good. But those kinds of things in terms of, if we had a way where it didn't cost us so much time, because the work of civic engagement is costly, and that's like a real thing in terms of how can we do this if we're already so busy. But if you get a sense of, okay, your data is going to be taken up, and we'll try to explain how it's going to be anonymized or hashed, or no harm will come from it, and we dump the data in 24-hour or 48-hour cycles, many of us would say, okay, I'm willing to take that risk. It's kind of worth it. But that there's not even that level of how can we understand actually what's happening on the streets of the city, let alone what's going on with the private companies. I hope that's where we are in terms of what would it mean to be responsible, both companies and the rest. That's a long answer. Mm-hmm.
Have you seen any changes, Sadia, in how people are engaging with tech or advocating for change?
I think I've noticed some healthy skepticism, which is much more normal now. Like, you're not that odd person where you're like, we shouldn't trust them, and people are like, oh my God, don't talk to that person. It's much more normal to be questioning it, which is, I think, really, really good. We're not doing it enough, and I think it's partially tied to what you're saying, which is we don't know enough. You know, you need to have a vocabulary, a shared vocabulary that we can use to talk about these things. And none of this is a coincidence. I think so much of this comes down to political will, right? Even our trade-offs are political will. And while engaging the public is really costly, it is also the only thing that's going to be sticky in terms of delivering justice for us. So that whole, again, the trade-off of, do we educate the public about what it's like for a driver to work for Uber is really, really important for them to understand that it's a very extractive model, and there's a side where there's a lot of money being made, but there are people who are not being paid enough and being overworked and all of those issues. So I would say that there is trickling awareness, but more of an appetite, I think, since Cambridge Analytica, et cetera. I would say that there's also a counter of politicians being really, really afraid to say no to private companies and their proposals, because unfortunately we're stuck in this 2-year or 4-year election cycle thing where they want to announce a thing before you are going to go to the polls to vote, and that thing needs to have jobs. There's a whole formula which is really dated, and it's keeping us from engaging with things in a long-term way, and this stuff is a long view of time, right? So we can't have a discussion about trade-offs if we don't understand, what are we aiming to make better. These things don't work in 4-year cycles. They just don't. Right. And our commitments and our investments need to be looked at differently. So I think that we need to get more engaged in terms of how our politicians are acting, and also give them permission to say no. I think a big thing with Sidewalk, for the 2 years Sidewalk Toronto, has been there are politicians who understand, if you have a private conversation with them, they're like, yeah, no, this is really messed up. They're trying to be the government. They're trying to come in and do the work of what a municipal government should be doing. What are they doing talking about affordable housing, all of these things. But they would not go on public record to say that.
Why do you think that is?
I think that they're afraid of the penalty. They're afraid of being labeled somebody who is not pro-innovation or not pro-jobs, and this is not a coincidence. They've been cornered into this.
But we also have problems that we haven't been able to solve in terms of city government.
Fair.
Housing, among one. So, this is not new that we see private industry seeing an opportunity to take care of something better, and in a kind of platform economy economics in terms of profit, privatization, but we're going to deliver this so the people of your city are happier because the city is either too unorganized or doesn't have the right funding. When you talk to people at City Hall or any branch of local government, everyone's way overworked, and to ask them to learn new things is a lot to ask, and yet that's the nature of innovation, and that is what is funded in the whole ecosystem of these companies. That's literally what they're meant to do. And I think some of what our conversation is how do we change some of the framework in terms of what does innovation look like? How can we reorganize some of those models? And that is happening to a certain extent. I don't want to get too enthusiastic, but that is happening a bit in Silicon Valley as well.
I do think that it's bigger, right? It's everywhere, because I think that we turned a corner on a lot of these platform companies, and they're around 15-ish years old. So we have a track record now, which is, I think we forget that sometimes, that we can actually go and look at their track record before we hand them a contract or a proposal, what have you. And I do think that conversation is really important about what the dysfunctions are in our local governments. And sometimes it's really tempting and very human to think, oh my God, nothing will fix the gardener or transit, and here's a company that's coming in and saying, we have the cash and we'll do it, and you're like, oh, it's like magic. You just have them do this, but we can't do that without having an appropriate conversation about public consent, meaningful public consent of the trade-offs. So it's not, there's no actual formula that says if the government was the only one doing all of this, it would be good. Like, we need to have this conversation at a much deeper level and then decide.
Would you give a summary of the report you were talking about in terms of employment and IT sector in Canada?
Yes. So before this panel, I was just doing a little bit of research, and there was a report by IT Canada, and it found that Canada is actually suffering from a talent shortage when it comes to senior ranking positions. We don't have enough of the engineers, the developers, the individuals that a lot of companies in Toronto need to scale and grow. And it's interesting because Toronto, I'd say arguably on the world stage, is now seen as a leader when it comes to tech and AI, and yet there aren't enough people here, talented people, they say, here, that can fill those jobs. And it brings me back to, a question about, you guys are incredibly intelligent, experienced, and knowledgeable in this arena. Do you feel that there's maybe a class issue? Like, is there, like, for people who are maybe from environments or communities that are financially less affluent, they don't have the resources to understand how this will impact them. Do you see that there's a divide at all? Or is this just an issue that we're looking at and discussing now because Toronto has all this attention, this interest?
That's a tangled question. I think that it's never not an issue, right?
Yeah.
Access to information, knowledge, education is so stacked in terms of how much money you have or generational wealth or what have you. But I also, specifically speaking about Sidewalk, I've seen people who are really well-to-do, are tech savvy because they work in the tech sector. They can be very pro a lot of what is happening because I think that and they're not alone in this, but they don't understand how city governments work, how governance works, and how difficult it is to get control back if we give it away in terms of data.
Okay, so that's interesting.
Right? So I don't know if it's a class thing.
Yeah.
I definitely think that information helps, but I think that in terms of civic discourse, and I'd love to hear from you on this, we're a little starved.
The American president doesn't know how governance works.
It's a low bar, though, Beth.
It's a low bar. The statistics and the study that you referred to, just made me think more about, okay, we don't have enough people trained in this country in that sector. There's a bigger question there about, well, what's the future of work look like?
Right.
And instead of trying to just get more and more high school kids to go through STEM programs and do CS or business school, and obviously we've had that push in terms of university education and and high school and university.
Yeah.
I think we need to ask a broader question about how we can better engage in, thinking about what skills and what business and work can look like over the next 5 years and the next 10 years. It seems like a panic attack just to simply try to get more high schoolers to move through that tunnel. And you've had direct experience with this. Those are a lot of the people who I teach. And part of my job is to work with the engineers and work with the computer scientists to talk about how do we look at broader factors? How do we think about context? How do we think about if this data set speaks to a certain kind of outcome, what is it that went into the data set that would say, this neighborhood looks very violent, this neighborhood looks very safe? And those are a combination of different kinds of pieces of information that get picked up and put into the data set. So even though we use some of the language of data and you're an engineer and the rest of it, this is a good moment to try to take away the panic of Canada doesn't have enough IT workers and think about what is the big question that's actually being asked there.
And I also think these reports, and I'm not knocking on a particular report, I'm just saying there's always these reports around. Like I've seen one every year for the past 10 years. And I'm not saying that they're not true, but it's a very specific way of measuring something that may not be what it sounds like, you know? So on the one hand, we have talent shortage, but on the other hand, apparently we're marketing ourselves as, you know, cheap talent around the world. We're like, come have, you know, open your subsidiary branch plant thing here because we don't pay our workers enough and you will like that. And this is literally something that we are saying and pitching to the world. When we sent our proposal for the Amazon headquarter pitch, we actually had that in there. So something's fishy. Either we don't have enough people or we have lots of people and we don't pay them enough, and that's supposed to be a town. So what I'm saying in all of this is I think we need to change the framework of our conversations. And I think I have a bias because I work in labor. If we were having serious conversations about workers' rights, I think that a lot of what we're talking about segues into that, you know? If we were really taking care of people in our city, things like homelessness we should not have that. We are such a wealthy country, and this is the wealthiest city. The fact that we have 200,000 or so undocumented people here, like, these are basic things, and I'm saying this as somebody who loves technology, has worked in it forever, I'm very passionate about it. Technology is a tool. We need to get our priorities straight, and technology could be a really amazing tool to help with that, but it will not help us straighten our priorities. So I think there is this almost like fetishization of data collection. It's like it will come from the heavens and tell us what to do. And we won't have to make the hard decision. And that will never go away. I think we've been collecting data forever. We collect it on paper. Now it's like ubiquitous, and there's surveillance. I don't think that we are lacking data to tell us what we should be focusing on and funding long-term and short-term. And the solution is not a more robust pipeline of high schoolers who can code.
Right, and maybe not a more robust oil pipeline either.
That either, yeah.
But, so I mean, one of the questions that we have for all of you is, what are we asking in terms of reframing the conversation? Because if we come to these companies and say, we need to rethink this because we're not getting the outcomes we need, we're having more disparity, more fallout in society, is there a way that we can have this conversation that it's not simply pegged to financial outcomes? Because to the best of my knowledge, that has been the bottom line.
Yeah.
That's
And
been the
it
go-to.
depends on who's been driving it, right?
Yeah.
It's been driven by actors whose bottom line is the bottom line.
Right, but
Right.
then there are boards, there's a
For
whole
sure.
structure. But we've got a lot of people here who've been thinking about this. So we're interested in knowing how have you been thinking about how do we restructure some of these frameworks, because it's like we're being shoved down certain chutes, and I just don't think it's going to serve us.
I think that's such an important point too, because I think part of what's happened with Silicon Valley, I'd say culture, because it's an export, right? The hype is also part of what's going around the world, and there's this inevitability attached to it. It's like, well, it's gonna happen anyway. If you let it happen tomorrow or 3 days from now, what's the difference? And it's so not true, but sometimes when we forget where we've been, what our histories are and how much we've been able to get away from when it also looked inevitable, when the king was the most powerful person, like so many kings have been toppled. I think we forget that. And this is something that we can do for each other to remind ourselves that it's not inevitable. We can say no. And that needs to happen in so many conversations, right? Like, what is the off-ramp for any negotiation?
And so it's we're in the midst of election season. If you didn't know, we are. And we've kind of talked about reframing the discourse and how we think about technology and the economy, the future workforce, et cetera. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on what role the government should play? We touched on it a little bit, but all three parties, 4, depending on who you count.
3. Let's pretend 3.
3 have somewhat of a digital platform on their website, but doesn't go into too much detail about what role the government will play when it comes to private and public working together. Is there like a blueprint, or are there things that the government needs to think about in the short term and the long term? I think education would be one. I feel like sometimes the next generation don't have a firm understanding of what it means to give their data away, what the future repercussions are, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Honestly?
So toughie. Yeah.
I don't think they're going to change anything. This is job building, and what are they going to do? There could be more regulation around data privacy, but as was discussed in the last panel, they're not going to become like Germany and set up much more rigorous laws around privacy and protection.
And why do you think that?
Nobody wants to.
It works.
Have you ever heard anyone here say that?
True.
And perhaps the lower hanging fruit is, what do you do with open data and City Open Data? City of Toronto is an open data portal, as you guys know. I'm not going to ask how many people have been on it or how many people have used that data, because no one really uses that data. Like, if you go to Civic Tech Toronto on Tuesday nights, 50 people use that data.
And what is this data?
Traffic data, bike lane data, maybe things around housing availability, crime data, but data that's public because it's collected by the city. But the data that is really fraught is the private data. Google sends me monthly notes telling me where I've been. Because I use Google Maps, I use Gmail, I use the Docs, and as a service to me, they literally will list every place that I've been. And if I don't read the email, I was in New Orleans the other day and I'd forgotten where the restaurant was that I went to 6 months ago. So I looked on my phone on that date 6 months ago, and there it was. So if I know it, Google knows it too. So I think that some of the entanglement here is, let's say cities become brilliant around protecting public space and civic data in better ways. The data that people want is the private data, or the data that's super valuable is the private data. And right now, there's not sufficient leverage, but I think there could be in terms of what we're asking of these companies that we're fueling.
Is there anything in youth that...
There's so much there, right? Like, there are so many layers to this. In terms of, I do think that the government can play a very critical role, and it should be, because private companies are not public stewards. We elect our government to be our stewards, right? And I'm very, very hesitant to make individual people responsible for all the data choices that they need to make. The level, like, yes, there should be education, but it's also a lot. If you've ever tried to read terms and conditions for the things that you're signing up, like, that's your weekend, and maybe you'll get through, one of them. And they're designed to be inaccessible. Like, this is not a coincidence. And they change. So when you've said yes, something in there says, and by the way, we can change it anytime. You're also saying yes to all the changes that we will have in the future. Yes, good. And so what I'm saying is, it's not like we're buying a widget. And the government needs to understand that, and this can't be a responsibility of, my grandmother or a young child. We cannot say, no, don't use it, So there is a role to be played where we need to have a lot more moral courage, I think, to say no to things, or to slow down. I think that's been a big disappointment with this whole engagement with Sidewalk Labs, where not enough people were like, hey, we don't have enough of, a framework to assess this well, so let's slow down a bit. What's the hurry? The Portlands are not going anywhere. They've been here for a really long time, and they will be here. So let's take our time to figure this out. A lot more of us need to be able to say that. And the government is where we should be looking at. And I think it's also part of austerity and how we've gutted our governments and our public service, where we don't have expertise in there. So the people who are in charge now also don't understand what they're saying yes to or not. That's why there is so much lobbying from a company like Sidewalk Labs, where I think in April they were there 60 times or something. It's bananas. But that's where the information is coming from, because, so you can see how that can have a domino effect in how decisions get made. Literally lobbynomics.
Title for a new book.
Yes. Sounds like a depressing book.
You mentioned about how people move so fast. Things move so fast. Sometimes we need to slow down. Do you see that maybe as a participating factor in why we've seen so many privacy, alarms in recent years from some of the big tech companies? It seems like almost every other week you hear about big data being misused or abused, and in tech, the idea is you have to move fast so you can outpace the competition, but also to implement new apps, gadgets, opportunities. Do you see that as in any way linked? I've stumped them.
Yeah, I watched the Cambridge Analytica documentary that they put out on Netflix, and I didn't do further research to see if everything they said was true, but it did. The degree to which Facebook has been accused of allowing this group to take up data that clearly should have been illegal for a private company to hand over to another company. Maybe I just didn't pay enough attention to that part of the story. The other part of it is just some of the language around it. I forget, it wasn't Parliament, but the legislative group that people were bearing witness to, they had to acknowledge that Cambridge Analytica was historically military intelligence company, so this was all, this was military grade intelligence, counterintelligence weaponry or strategy that they're bringing to bear on the public. So the level of depth in terms of, oh yeah, they told us they erased that data from the hard drive, it really begs credibility that such clever people with so many rules about what we can do and we can know would just go with, oh yeah, they wiped the data.
Yeah.
So that kind of chain of enabling is it's helpful for that to be illuminated, but it's deeply, deeply troubling. In the US, with things like the Patriot Act and the extension of executive powers, so much can be just covered over. And then if we go to China, you have an entirely different set of rules and standards. And part of the problem with acceleration is we still are seeing that the companies that innovate the fastest, move the hardest,
yes,
in unregulated territories, gain the advantage, and we're in a pretty serious game of winner takes all that looks even different than the industrial landscape because of data, because data is a different kind of good than oil or cars and all the rest of it. So right now, China, because they're proceeding in a different regulatory space and different cultural context, there's essentially a Chinese internet. You've got Alibaba, you've got these huge, huge companies that now are having global impact, and they've got levels of just in the wild testing things out with AI that'd be illegal here. And we don't have, Sidewalk Lab looks laughable in relationship to the scale of some of this experimentation. And the problem is, people get very nervous because, like with the old language about the Cold War, they're arming up, we're not arming up, what are we supposed to be doing? Be quiet, you crybabies. And that didn't work out so well the first time. We won, I think, I don't know. But to have some sense also of kind of what the international, I don't know, it's not gamesmanship, but is it?
Landscape.
Like what that looks like. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't insist on civic, a kind of sense of civic engagement, that there's protections here, that there are rights here. But it's part of these weird pressures of the different aspects that are going into what's happening.
I have, so I'm interested, you talked about, just for instance, like the King streetcar, about how it's monitored and how your data is sniffed. I'm wondering, aside from like moving to like the wilderness in the middle of nowhere, is there any way you can opt out? Is there an easy method for the average person to smile, I see Sadia smiling, to opt out of their data just continually being like soaked up? Or is it just the price you pay when you're living in a society that's very innovation forward and tech focused?
I don't want to confuse innovation with surveillance. You know?
Okay, yeah.
I don't want to confuse that. And it's very, very easy to do that these days. So I'm like constantly reminding myself to be very, very mindful of how we talk about this. And this is the inevitability thing. So can a single person, an individual, do something? It's almost the wrong question, I think, because I think that what we need to grapple with is very collective, and we need to take responsibility for each other. So it's not me trying to save myself and my children, it's not about that. And again, I don't want to burden individual people with having to navigate the yes or no or opt in or out, because it's not accessible. It's too much to keep up with. It's a full-time job if you have like 5 apps just to keep up with what they're doing. So I think that the better question to me would be, how do we want, what is the world that we want to live in? Who is carrying all the risk? So much. There was a tiny example of that is a lot of people in the tech sector would say, well, if you're going to live in the Quayside area, which is where Sidewalk Labs wants to build the smart city, well, then you are agreeing to the terms of living in that city, right?
Yeah.
And then, in the same breath, we're having a conversation about there being affordable housing there and low-income housing. So, are you choosing to live there, and are they making this decision? And is the choice that I'm being given, if I'm a low-income person, that you either get housing or get your, give up all your data and your privacy, and that's not a choice. So I'm much more interested, I think, in exploring our collective power as residents, as workers, and saying no to things that don't work for us, that we know historically. We don't need more data to tell us. Surveillance has been done for hundreds of years on particular people. We know this. These are our histories, right?
Yeah, but we also have to have the courage to work again across lines of difference that we haven't had for such a long time. And some of you were part of different movements of solidarity and really disruptive social change. Some of us to different degrees. We've been both the inheritors of it and carried that on. But that's the other thing, like some of these things are really tough questions if indeed we need kind of a collective, like really a city to speak and say no, or we're moving in this direction. But it's very difficult for it not to fall down around district, neighborhood, block, house. I'm having difficulty sharing trash cans with my neighbor. So, you know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of kind of, it's not collegial, but how do you call it? Like neighborliness? Like, this, as far as I can tell, is not a tech issue, neighborliness.
Interesting. Yeah.
But that
I'm sure
the lack
there's an
of
app
it
for
is-
that.
There must be an app. Meet your neighbor app.
Yeah.
Halloween is like the most neighborly night we have.
So true. Because of candy.
Yeah, and you ring on strangers. You know, so.
But it's so true, and this is what I mean. I think the questions are actually different questions. The ones that we should be wrestling with are different questions, right? And it's really easy to fall into whether a technology solution can come in and like fix
Just
it.
fix everything.
But these are hard conversations. Like we need to have hard conversations. However, that does not mean that we don't push for good regulatory frameworks. That does not mean that we don't say we don't have policy to regulate this thing or legislate it, and therefore we're going to pause. We're going to reset it. We're not going to do this right now. We're going to do this in 2 years. In these 2 years, we're going to have public engagement, and we're going to figure out what our risk threshold is. Full circle back to where you started, right? Because I don't think that we can move forward towards a more fair and just city, which I believe that most people want, without having those hard conversations. And we need to, and they need to happen in churches, in city council, in schools, over trash cans, like all of these things need to happen, right? And in some of these instances, there are efficiencies that technology can introduce, but we can't give it more credit than it deserves. And it's just a tool amongst many other tools. And it's really, I think, it's not sexy to talk about the things that I'm talking about, because it's so much more sexier to go look for money for an app that will introduce you to your neighbor. But I think that that's where we are. Like, we have to reckon with the time and the place where we stand and pick our priorities. And can we use the tools that we have to make it better, faster? Like, I love, like, Twitter is a cesspool, but also Twitter has, like, changed my life. Like, I'm connected to people I have no business being connected to, and I'm learning from them. So it's trade-offs, right? I know that it's a cesspool, and I'm like, okay, here's the log off button for like 2 weeks because, you know, sanity. But also, you can go back. So I think that we need to get to that point where we're able to make those decisions collectively as well and say, we don't want cameras everywhere. You know? The decisions that we need to make for our city, we already know. What we need is money. Where is money? Rich people. Let's tax them. So we know.